Good evening. I'm Nadia Sheikh. I'm the Vice Provost for Cultural and Research Engagement here at NYU Abu Dhabi. I welcome you here this evening to this talk by Dr. Cristina de la Puente entitled The Legacy of al-Andalus, Material and Textual Sources. Al-Andalus is a term used by historians to refer to a period when Muslim sovereigns ruled parts of the Iberian Peninsula. It begins in 711 with the arrival of a small Muslim force led by the Umayyad general Tariq ibn Ziyad and ends in 1492 with the conquest of Granada. However, the historical career of Al-Andalus does not abruptly conclude with the defeat in 1492, but continues to exert its presence. With the collapse of Muslim rule, the history of the peninsula proceeds along at least three pathways: the path of exile for Muslims and Jews. The second is that defined by the country's Christian European trajectory. And the third historical pathway is Andalusismo, a Mediterranean society entwined with Christian, Islamic, and Jewish cultural forms and bound, therefore, to the people and nations across the sea. In 2003, Maria Rosa Menocal published The Ornament of the World: How Muslims, Jews, and Christians Created a Culture of Tolerance in Medieval Spain. This beautiful book tries to undo the notion of the Middle Ages as a period of religious persecution and intellectual stagnation. Instead, Maria Menocal paints a portrait of Al-Andalus as a culture where literature, science, and tolerance flourished for 500 years. Combining the best of what Muslim, Jewish, and Christian cultures had to offer, Al-Andalus influenced the rest of Europe in multiple ways. The Institute's lecture series on the legacy of Al-Andalus aims to share the remarkable story of a unique time in history when Muslims, Christians, and Jews forged a common cultural identity that frequently transcended their religious differences. Stories of a time when these three groups managed to sustain relationships that enabled them to coexist, collaborate, and flourish. We are inaugurating the series on the legacy of Al-Andalus with Dr. Cristina de la Puente, a scientific researcher at the Department of Jewish and Islamic Studies at the Spanish National Research Council. Her expertise areas are history of Al-Andalus, Islamic religiosity in Al-Andalus, hadith transmissions especially, theory and practice of Islamic law with a special focus on social history. She has written extensively on these topics. Most recently, in 2022, she co-published Connected Stories, Contacts, Traditions, and Transmission in Pre-Modern Mediterranean Islam. She is currently leading the research project Gender, Family, and Slavery, as well as another research project on Arabic philology. Thank you, Dr. de la Puente, for being with us. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the NYU for the invitation, and very especially my colleague Nadia Sheikh for having thought of me to participate in this series of conferences of Al-Andalus. I, like most of my Spanish Arabist colleagues, work on Al-Andalus or on the Islamic West. There are several reasons for this. We Spaniards perceive the history of Al-Andalus as an important part of our own history. This was very relevant from the second half of the 19th century, when the first chairs of Arabic language and history of Al-Andalus began to be created in Spanish universities. As you all know, scholars often have to justify our existence, especially in the fields of humanities. Justifying the creation of chairs of Arabic was easy if they were understood as positions related to the national history itself. I'll speak later about this question because I think it's important. This has been an important reason for understanding our interest in Al-Andalus, But there is another more obvious one, proximity to the sources. The legacy of Al-Andalus is present in our lives, especially that related to the material legacy. But there is another textual legacy, less known to a general public, that has enormous wealth and which we can access with some ease. My goal in this paper is not to talk about the history of Al-Andalus. Other colleagues will do it in other lectures. My goal is to make known where the main sources are to know the history of Al-Andalus, what characteristics they have, and to show what is the main contribution of Spanish Arabism to the study of Al-Andalus. With all the flaws it may have, it is currently not possible to undertake a study of the literature, art, or history of Al-Andalus without being able to read Spanish nowadays. Although English is the usual language of communication today in the academic world, it was not until very recently, and in the case of Al-Andalus, the most relevant studies are written in French and Spanish. French Arabism has also shown a special predilection for the study of this region, of the Islamic world, and the reasons are related with our own reasons to the Spaniards. That's the proximity to the sources. Between the year, as Professor Sheikh said, between the year 711 and 1492, part of the Iberian Peninsula constituted one more region within the Islamic world. During the first centuries, Al-Andalus underwent a gradual process of Arabization and Islamization and received knowledge and sciences that came from the East. When we talk about Al-Andalus, we tend to think on Spain and Portugal nowadays, but it depends on the year we are talking about. So that's the progress of the Christian conquest. So if we are talking about Al-Andalus in the year, for example, 1150, that's Al-Andalus was only the south, middle of the Iberian Peninsula nowadays. There are two rivers which were the frontier for centuries, Duero and Tagus. If we compare these rivers with the northern European rivers or with the American rivers, they are streams. But they were very, very important in history because they were the frontier. So when we are talking, for example, about Al-Andalus in the 13th, 14th, or 15th centuries, we are talking only about the provinces of Granada, Malaga, and Almeria nowadays. So this small corner of the Iberian Peninsula. So it depends on the year and of the progress of the Christian conquest. So when I saw the announcement of this conference, I saw the Al-Andalus, also the whole map. That was Al-Andalus really in the 8th century. During the first centuries, Al-Andalus underwent a gradual process of Arabization and Islamization and received knowledge and sciences that came from the East. Pilgrimage to Mecca and study tours to the great centers of knowledge, Baghdad, Basra, Kufa, Damascus, or Cairo, made it possible for works written in the East to reach Al-Andalus. Andalusis, I prefer the word Andalusi than Andalusian because we don't have to confuse Andalusia, which is nowadays a region of Spain, a big region, but it's just a region than Al-Andalus, which were in other centuries much more than Andalusia. And when we think on we can find Andalusi art, for example, in the north of the peninsula, not only in the south. Andalusis themselves soon started not only to study, but also to create works belonging to a wide variety of genres: religious sciences, Quranic studies, prophetic traditions, legal works, etc. poetry, grammar, literature, and biographical dictionaries, as well as what were known as the science of the ancients, medicine, agronomy, and so forth. From the 10th century on, some cities in Al-Andalus began to be classed among the great focal points of knowledge in the Islamic world, while the productions of cities including Córdoba, Toledo, or Seville started to be exported to the east. Al-Andalus gave to the Arabic world authors of high standing, some of them universals, such as Ibn Hazm or Ibn Rushd, the grandson Averroes for the Christians. Many works from that broad intellectual production are conserved in libraries all over the world and can be read today. Works that had remained unknown or hidden away have come to light thanks to constant publishing work that began at the end of the 18th century and still continues in our times. In some cases, these Andalusi works provide the most important evidence for certain genres in Arabic during the Middle Ages. For example, works of agronomy that were composed in Al-Andalus by authors such as Ibn al-Awwam, Ibn Bassal, or Ibn Hajjaj are unique pieces that let us know the nature of food and agriculture in the Arabic world between the 10th and 14th centuries. Along with this written legacy on agriculture, it should be mentioned that in some regions of Spain, an Arab influence is still perceived in gastronomy, for example, in the sweets that we eat nowadays. The Spanish language has 4,000 words of Arabic origin. One of the most relevant lexical fields of these Arabic words is agriculture and food. The textual sources are of great richness and extension. However, it is also necessary to point out that there is something that we are not going to find in Al-Andalus, which are documents, for example, royal or legal documents. The reason is that the Western Islamic world was not introduced to archives until colonial times in the 19th century. The few Andalusian documents that have survived belong to the last period of the Kingdom of Granada in the 15th century. Their survival is due to the fact that they fell into Christian hands, and the Christians preserved them. In exchange, historical chronicles and notarial manuals have been preserved that allow us to fill in, even if only partially, this lack. So in Morocco, for example, there weren't archives till the French occupation of the country. And the first archives in the Islamic world were those of in Egypt of the Mamluk Empire and the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, the lack of documentation contrasts with the abundance of works written by the Andalusis. These works are mainly kept in libraries, although in Morocco there are still quite a few in private hands. Although there are Andalusi works in the libraries of Berlin, Paris, London, Cairo, Damascus, Rabat, Timbuktu, etc., Spain also houses some of the most interesting manuscripts, principally in 3 institutions located in Madrid and its province: the National Library, the Library of the Royal Academy of History, which is in the center of the city, like this one, and the monastery, the Royal Monastery of El Escorial, this one. This one, which is, I think, 60 or 70 kilometers far from Madrid. the most important collection is the latter, so that of the monastery of El Escorial. Not only because it contains the greatest number of Arabic manuscripts in Spain, but because it is one of the best collections in the world. The monastery of El Escorial was built by King Philip II in the 16th century to commemorate a victory of the Spanish Empire against France at San Quentin in 1557. The king was a great collector of ancient works, and his collections grew due to the organized purchase of works and libraries. This task was always supervised by the king himself. Years later, in 1612, during the reign of his son Philip III, part of the Spanish fleet captured the ship in which the Sultan of Morocco, Moulay Zaidan, was sailing into exile, taking his library with him. The Sultan made the mistake of offering the King of Spain an extremely high ransom payment for his books, which made the king understand that their value was, leading him to decide not to exchange them for captives and to keep them in his library. It must be remembered that in the 17th century was a period in Mediterranean history when there were frequent captures of ships, slaves, and other goods, along with the ransoms that were paid for them. I'm going to show you. This is the interior of the library of El Escorial. And if you visit this monastery, you have to visit the library and to visit the royal pantheon, because the kings of Spain are buried there. And it's very beautiful too. This is one of the manuscripts of El Escorial. That is the interior of the National Library. And these are the kings, Philip II and Philip III. So this is some of the books of the collection of Moulay Zaidan of Morocco. We can understand perfectly that he wanted to pay a lot of money for the books. And I'm going to speak about this one now. Meanwhile, a third of the contents of the El Escorial library owes a debt to another great collector, the Count Duke of Olivares, this one. It was painted by Velázquez, minister of King Philip IV, who created a large personal library during the first half of the 17th century, whose collections went to El Escorial on his death. These acquisitions do not tell the whole story, however. In 1671, part of the library was burned, and some 2,500 Arabic codices perished in the fire. Today, around 2,000 codices have been preserved, containing works belonging to all young. In addition to the libraries, numerous texts in Arabic are preserved in the archives. The Spanish have a habit of filing everything, as happened in the Ottoman Empire. Many archives are preserved, local, provincial, and state. The archives of the cathedrals, for example, are very rich in this documentation and in others. The most relevant are the archive of the Crown of Aragon in Barcelona, this one, in the city center, in the medieval building. Now they have another new building, this one. Oh, sorry. I always commit a mistake with it. Okay. Here. This is the new one, which is very ugly, as you can see. This is the most relevant, one of the most important, richest in Europe, the archive of the Crown of. There is another one, the Crown of of Castile, which we'll see it later. All of these images are of the Crown of Aragon, This is a book in the archive of the Crown of Aragon. And I don't know where, yes, I know. This is the National Archive in Madrid, in the city. That's some books. This archive contains an important collection of Morisco manuscripts. I'll explain later what kind of texts are. If you try to read it, you cannot, because it is written in Spanish with Arabic letters. When the Arabic population was expelled, they obliged to convert to Islam after the Christian conquest in the 1492. The Muslim, ex-Muslim community, theoretically they converted. They began to write in Spanish with the Arabic alphabet. So, and we have a lot of literature, which we call it al-Jamia. It's very interesting. They wrote a lot of religious books, and we don't know really why they do it like this, because they don't explain it. One reason could be that Christians couldn't see that they were Muslim texts. For example, this book is a history of the book of Yusuf, based in the Quranic passage of the history of the story of Yusuf in the Quran. It would be a reason. Another reason is that they were losing the language. They were losing their Arabic and speaking only the second and the third generation. They were only speaking Spanish, but it was a part of their identity, the alphabet, and to remember their origins. And we know that the conversion was not total, but that was one of the reasons. There were some rebellions of Moriscos in the peninsula, and in the year 1609, the King Philip III expelled them from the peninsula forever. So, but there are some collections of these books, and some of them are in the National Archive in Madrid. Another collection, which is quite interesting, is in my research center in Madrid. There is a collection which comes from a little village in the north of Spain, in Aragon. At the beginning of the 20th century, an Arabist from this region heard that the children were destroying some texts, some written in very exotic letters, or nobody could read that. Then he went there, and it was one of these collections. And the village is Almonacid de la Sierra, and now the collection is in my research. It all is digitalized, and I think that it was possible with the help of the money of the Emirates, or you can consult it online if you want. So the third, this is in my library, Biblioteca Tomás Navarro Tomás, where I work. This is another text. So you can read the first line, and then it begins, it's a mix of Spanish and the third archive, which is quite important too, is the archive of the Crown of Castile in Simancas, in Valladolid, in the north of Spain. It's inside this castle, this Christian castle. This is one of the texts, and the most important collection here related with the Arab Islamic world are the letters of the sultans of Morocco to the Spanish kings. The letters that the Spanish kings sent to the sultans were lost because they didn't have archives, but all the letters written by the sultans of Morocco are preserved in this archive, and some of them were published. Before examining the interest that these books and documents have, it is perhaps necessary to run back through some episodes in the history of Spain. After the conquest of Granada in 1492, Spain became a Christian Catholic country, and Muslims who wished to remain on the Iberian Peninsula had to convert to Christianity. Known as Moriscos, this is one who wrote this text, they were definitively expelled from Spain in 1609. The Moriscos forgot Arabic, but kept their traditions and alphabet. Manuscripts of theirs have been conserved, written in Spanish using Arabic letters, a rich literature employing Arabic characters, which includes, for instance, many religious texts. With the expulsion of the Moriscos, the Spanish would no longer be able to read either Arabic or the alphabet. But that did not mean they forgot the past of al-Andalus. Several monuments and remains reminded them of that past in different regions, not only in Andalusia, some of which were located far to the north of the peninsula. Castle palaces, called alcázares in Spanish today, Arabic baths, walls, bridges, and mosques are still preserved today. So we can see some examples, some castles, there are a lot more. Alhambra is the most well-known palace in Granada. That is in the north of Spain, in Zaragoza, La Aljaferia. This is the bridge of Ronda, for example, and the baths in the city of Ronda in the province of Málaga. So it was impossible to forget that the Arabs were there. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment brought with it an interest in the science and cultures of other countries to Europe. This included a curiosity towards technological and scientific advances, and the Spanish were aware that in another time the Iberian Peninsula had been of special relevance in the science when under Muslim rule. Spain was not a stranger to the progress made in the Enlightenment, and its monarchs attempted to recover practices and processes that they knew had thrived in the Middle Ages, but were lost after the Arabs were expelled from the peninsula. The Spanish could no longer read Arabic, but knew that their libraries contained important texts. They were conscious of the significance of these sources and of the Arabic legacy, which was not only present in their libraries, but in their art, architecture, gastronomy, etc. In that century, King Charles III, this one, asked a Lebanese Maronite monk who had traveled to Spain to make the first catalogue of these works that nobody had been able to read for 2 centuries, but which had been carefully conserved. Qasiri, that was his name, made the first catalogue, which was corrected and completed in the 19th century by Hartwig Derenburg in the second half of the 19th century. A minister of the same king commissioned the translation from Arabic to Spanish of the Book of Agriculture, Kitab al-Filaha, by Ibn al-Awam, a civilian author who lived between the 12th and the 13th centuries, considering it to be not only, the minister says, not only beneficial, but absolutely necessary to improve farming and animal husbandry in Spain. The translator of the book, Banchieri, finished the task in 1802, so 20 years later, when the minister had already died and the work could not be distributed among the landowners, as had been his wish, but it has survived until the present day as a bibliographical treasure. So one of the feelings, more common feeling after the expulsion of the Moriscos was that the countryside was abandoned, partially abandoned, but because most of the Moriscos were dedicated to agriculture. So, and they knew a lot of techniques that the Spaniards didn't know. So the loss in agriculture was very important in the 17th century because this expulsion. The 19th century is the time of European colonialism and Orientalism. On the one hand, of the incorporation of scientific methodologies within knowledge and other cultures and languages. Spain is not a great colonial power during this period, but by the second half of the century, it has growing interest in Morocco, which will be one of the reasons behind the interest in the Arabic language and a culture which it feels to be both very close and very far at the same time. In this time, in the 19th century, this is when professorships in history and philology are being created the most of the European universities, and in this Spain constitutes no exception. Spanish Arabists focus their interest on al-Andalus because they have the written, artistic, and architectural sources very close at hand. On the other hand, in their universities, they are faced with a need to justify a specialization in both Arabic and Islamic studies. That is a very minority pursuit and is initially perceived as exotic. They must compete with other philologies, such as the classical languages, Latin and Greek, or with the vigor of modern languages. In their defense, the Arabists argue that al-Andalus is an important part of Spain's history, of our Middle Ages, and that in today's Spain, many traces of al-Andalus survive. In a nutshell, they claim that al-Andalus and Spain are one and the same thing. There begins to be talk of Muslim Spain. You can read a lot of books where they don't speak about al-Andalus, but about Muslim Spain, as opposed to the Christian Spain of the Middle Ages. And Muslim Spain is characterized as displaying features that they consider intrinsic to the Spanish character. That is typical of the historiography of the 19th century. So the Andalusians were great people because they were Spaniards. So that's the argumentation of our 19th century Arabists. This will bring consequences for Spanish Arabism and Spanish historiography at the end of the 19th century and at the first of the 20th century. The Spanish are not alone in this quest. European and in particular French Arabists joined with them in their curiosity to know and make known Arabic Islamic manuscript collections and vestiges on the Iberian Peninsula. In outline, the history of al-Andalus may be said to be marked by two idealizations. On one hand, that of the Spanish themselves, who consider it to form part of their past, and on the other, and of no less importance, that of the Arabs, who also see it as part of their glorious past, and having lost it, tend to recall its exploits, its sources, its smokes, and so on. Both parties forget that al-Andalus was but one more region in the vast Islamic empire, first of all Umayyad and then Abbasid, and that it did not much differ from other regions. It is true that the Andalusians gave marvelous buildings and thinkers of great importance to the world, but so also did other places in the Islamic world, such as Iraq, Syria, and Iran. It is still frequent today to find references to that idealization in the press of the Arabic world and in discourses by their politicians, which has also given rise to quite fascinating and beautiful modern literary pieces, including the poems of Mahmoud Darwish, for example, where Spain appears in a highly idealized form. But we can read a lot of discourses like this. One of the most famous was the discourse of President Obama in Cairo where they were talking about the tolerance in al-Andalus, and so it was famous because he mixed al-Andalus with Inquisition, which is began late after the expulsion of the Muslims. So it was crazy, the discourse, but the Egyptians were very happy because the main message was that the tolerance was typical from al-Andalus. So, and there is another topic that we can read every word too, that is that women were very free in al-Andalus. They were so free, like in other parts of the Islamic world, and in the Middle Ages. So to speak in the Middle Ages about women freedom is curious. Anyway, but it's a topic. It's and feminists in the Arab countries use it very often. It is possible because there was a time in al-Andalus nobody can say it is not like this. Well, people, serious people did, but nobody read our books. So after this brief introduction to al-Andalus, I shall very briefly explain and identify the works that have been preserved and rarely when they were composed. The wealth of Andalusian intellectual production is associated with a complex education system that has been well studied. Al-Andalus had no schools until the 14th century, much later than in the East. But that did not mean that young people had no access to higher education, or that they were less prepared than youth in other regions of the Islamic world. Well-off Andalusi families used to send their children to study with a school teacher who they accompanied over a long period. He gave his classes in the mosque or in his house. They began by being trained in knowledge of Arabic, language, grammar, and calligraphy, and afterwards, or simultaneously, in the religious sciences, Quran and its readings, the prophetic traditions, while they often received notions of jurisprudence. The predominant and almost only legal school in al-Andalus from the 9th century until the final end was the Maliki school. Some, in addition, gained a training in the reading of poetry and literature. Boys and youth, when they acquired a certain level, obtained it from a particular school teacher or from a number of educators, a license for transmission or teaching, the ijaza, which accordingly enabled them to teach others what they had learned. Those who had a schoolmaster who had traveled to the East had the opportunity to make acquainted with works imported by him to the peninsula, and they contributed to disseminate them. Each pupil was in turn a copyist, as they had to copy the works they learned in order to dictate them to others. So the system was very complex, but very, it is one of the reasons we have so good collections and literature disseminate in the Western Islamic world without schools, so physical schools. The first one is the madrasa in Granada in the 14th century, and the building is preserved, and we can visit it today, the building of the madrasa. This whole system of education is known about thanks to Andalusi biographical dictionaries that have been conserved, and they stand out as a gem in medieval Arabic literature. From the 9th to the 14th century, we have documentation as to the nature of the intellectual production of Al-Andalus due to the biographical dictionaries. Each one is the continuation of an immediately previous work, to the extent that we can state that there are no bibliographical gaps from all those centuries. The authors have a dual intention. on one hand, to document the names of Andalusi authors, their works and their transmissions, and more importantly, in order to know what the chains of transmission of the religious sciences are, so as to be able to make the chain reach one of the ancestors, Salaf, the companions of the Prophet, or the Prophet Muhammad himself. The authors offer us simple biographies in which they firstly provide the name of the biography, which is information of great interest because it allows us to know his origins, whether he was Arab, Berber, if he came from a Christian family that had converted to Islam after the conquest, and similar. It also lets us know the geographical origin and other circumstances of relevance for the historian. The author then goes on to tell us who his teachers were, the works he studied, whether he composed any himself, and who his disciples were. We are also told if he made the pilgrimage to Mecca and if he resided for any time in any of the Eastern intellectual centers of his period, and who his teachers there were. It is really surprising to see the great mobility of the Andalusis, the ease with which they traveled to Arabia and to the Middle East by land and by sea, sometimes on a number of occasions in their lives. Lastly, he gives us an important piece of information regarding the date of his death, which enables us to properly place him within a chain of cultural transmission. The biographical dictionaries complement the historical chronicles, which also constitute rich sources in al-Andalus, especially for the Umayyad period and for Nasari Granada. The chronicles concept are, above all, Palatine annals that allow us to know the main events of the court. We even have a first-person account by one of the Taifa kings, a king of the Taifa of Granada, a wonderful autobiography in which he relates what occurred in his kingdom until he was vanquished by the North African Almoravids. An exceptional narrative that quite reliably takes us closer to the history of Al-Andalus. Naturally, there are always gaps given the urban and elitist nature of these sources. We know very little, for example, of what happened in the countryside or far from the important urban centers. We don't know anything about farmers, for example. And there is a big discussion nowadays if the people in the countries were converted into Islam or not, and in which moment. But in this case, we move in the field of speculation because we could never know because we don't have sources. Like, in the same way, we don't have real documents. Under this educational system, as might be expected, the first works that are composed dating from the end of the 8th and beginning of the 9th century are associated with the Quran, commentaries, works reading the 7 readings of the Quran, works involving hadith and prayers, and several legal works. These productions concludes in the 12th century with the great jurist Ibn Rushd, grandfather of the famous jurist, philosopher, and doctor Ibn Rushd, the grandson known in the West as Averroes. The grandfather of Averroes is celebrated for 2 large works, his collection of fatwas in 2 volumes, and a 24-volume commentary on al-Utbid's missing 9th century legal work. In a later period, towards the end of the 12th century, other religious works began to be composed. Along with works dealing with prophetic traditions, we also find prayer treatises and ascetic texts, some of which are also mystical. Furthermore, in Al-Andalus, one of the most famous mystics in the Islamic world is born, Ibn Arabi of Murcia, who studied there in his youth, but soon left and eventually died in Damascus. Mystic literature will be of relevance during the 14th century and will have an influence on what is produced in North Africa. The splendor of Andalusi poetry has its heyday in the 11th century, after the disintegration of the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba into small kingdoms, the Taifa kingdoms. The kings, in their courts, surrounded themselves with poets and competed amongst themselves to have the best ones. This was the time of Ibn Zaydun and Ibn Sahl. Even one of the kings, al-Mu'tamid, was a recognized poet. This century saw the appearance of the author of the famous work, The Ring of the Dove, Ibn Hazm, who was also an important theologian and a Zahiri jurist, whose legal work is of much interest due to its originality within a mainly Maliki context. In addition, Andalusis composed works pertaining to the science of the ancients, as the Arabs called medicine or astronomy and other sciences. It must also be mentioned that part of Arabic production in science and literature became known in Europe in the 13th century thanks to the interest shown by the King of Castile, Alfonso X, known as the Wise. In his capital, Toledo, he brought together several Muslim and Jewish savants who translated into Spanish and Latin fundamental works that exercised great influence in Europe at the end of the Middle Ages, and after that in the European Renaissance. The continual wars between Christians and Muslims did not stand in the way of a mutual admiration that enabled the transmission and dissemination of works to the other side of the border. Although coexistence between the three cultures of the Iberian Peninsula has been idealized, for neither was it always peaceful, nor was it characterized by the tolerance of any of the parties concerned. This coexistence did make possible a fundamental fact, that of being well acquainted with the other, even when the other was considered to be an enemy, and of taking from the other culture was what deemed best and most advantageous. During the first centuries, between the 8th and the 12th, the Christians were aware that Andalusis were far more advanced in the sciences, art, and other fields, and took from them what they could even after the conquest of territories. To give an example, the Christian monarchs had to work for them Muslim workers, and there is a characteristically peninsular art that is known as mudéjar that does not exist in the rest of Europe. After the 13th century, it was the Muslims who began to take from the West things that were unknown to them, and what was essential Andalusi started to be exported on a massive scale to the East. I have to explain just I come back to the other one. This is some buildings of the period in Toledo, of the period and what that is an image of one of the books of Alfonso the Wise, when two players, and one of them is Arab, you can see, and so we have to take always into account we have different types of population in the Iberian Peninsula in this period. And when we talk about the art, for example, we have to distinguish which kind of population built this art, or this art. For example, we can, when we talk of Andalusis, we talk about the Muslims living under Muslim rule in their territory. There were most Arabs, they were the Christians living under Muslim rule in al-Andalus, a minority, they have their own art too. Mudéjars, they were the Muslims living under Christian rule in territories conquered by the Christians. So they were there living and working for the Christians. And they developed a very interesting art. I'm going to show you some pictures. And then the Moriscos, after the total Christian conquest of the peninsula, the Muslim populations who were still living for 1 century in Spain. So, and Mozárabs and Mudéjars developed their own art. That is the Mudéjar, which is quite interesting. It is an example of buildings built by the Muslims for the Christians, because the Christians knew they were the best workers. So, and they did the most beautiful things in this period, so they were working for them. And this is the ceilings, for example, of this is typical. We can see it in a lot of cathedrals and churches in Spain. And there are different, this is a church, San Martín in Teruel, and this one is in Quito, in El Ecuador, because we exported, with the Spanish conquest of America, we exported this art to America, and it's very representative, the arte mudéjar, the mudéjar art in the Spanish countries of Latin America. So, and this is an example of Quito, but we can find a lot in Peru and in other American countries. And this one are 2 examples of Mozárab art. This is the churches built by the Christians in Muslim territory. This is in León, when León was part of al-Andalus. And there are not a lot, of course, because we only have Mozárabs in the first 2 centuries of the al-Andalus. But it's very interesting. If you see the arcade, the arcs, you can see the Islamic model perfectly in the Christian church. And they are very interesting because they are very old churches. I'm going to finish. Okay. I shall wind up this conference by referring to the Spanish intellectuals who, since the end of the 19th century, have devoted their efforts to publishing, translating, and studying the Andalusian legacy. We call them the Banu Codera, so the children of Codera, because the first Spanish Arabists to approach the Arabic Islamic world through a scientific approach was Francisco Codera, this one. And his disciples devised a system. This is Julián Rivera and Miguel Asín, 2 disciples of Codera, devised a system for transcribing the Arabic language into the Spanish tongue that enabled the adaptation of Arabic to Spanish phonetics. At the beginning of the 1930s, a scientific journal, al-Andalus, was founded. And it was, it's a bit dirty, the book. It comes from the 30s. I didn't notice it when I took the photo. At the beginning of the, and it was published, al-Andalus was published until 1980. And since 1980, continued in the shape of another journal named Alcántara. Today, Alcántara is one of the most prestigious journals dedicated to Arabic and Islamic studies in the world, specializing principally in the study of the Muslim West between the 7th and the 17th century. It encompasses all kinds of studies, linguistic, historical, religious, archaeological, and others, and publishes 2 volumes a year. And it's open access, so you can find it very easily. On the other hand, the foundation of the journal Al-Andalus was a consequence of the foundation of the School of Arab Studies of Granada, Madrid, at the end of the 30s, in 1932, since the second third of the 19th century until today, the efforts of philologists, art historians, archaeologists, and others in the field have continued steadily, giving rise to plentiful results in the shape of articles and monographs. Spanish historiography concerning the Islamic West, and particularly al-Andalus, occupies a frontline position in European studies in this subject area. Among other results, we should mention the collection Fuentes Arábico-Hispanas, which has been a CSIC publication. I showed the photo before. Those are 2 books of the collection, which has been a CSIC, so the Spanish National Research Council publication, since 1990, and to date numbers 33 works. There are different universities in Spain where Arabic and Islamology are studied, 2 in Madrid, 2 in Barcelona, then Alicante, Granada, Almería, Seville, and Salamanca. And despite the crisis and budget cuts, a substantial number of researchers devote their time to these studies. It is no longer necessary to argue in defense of the history of al-Andalus. We don't need to say it's part of our history. We know exactly what al-Andalus is nowadays, because this work thus has continued for more than a century, has made the Spanish very aware of what al-Andalus meant in their past, and they are increasingly better informed regarding its legacy. So it is solo. It is only. I only wanted to show just a bit of the rich legacy we have. I have shown a lot of books which are published and edited and studied, but in these libraries I have shown to you, you can find a lot of work to do, a lot of unedited and unpublished manuscripts which deserve attention and scholarship. So thank you very much for your attention.